Hello, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to our second book talk in our series, Reimagining the Latinx Experience in America. For this talk, we're very fortunate to have joining us Professor María Rendón and Professor Edward Thayes, and they will be discussing Professor Rendón's new book, Stagnant Dreamers. So here's a copy for you to see. And I also wanted to let you know that our next book talk will take place on Monday, October 13th. It's also at noon. And we'll be hearing from Laura Enriquez about her book, Of Love and Papers, How Immigration Policy Affects Romance and Family. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge a few people who've helped to make this book talk possible, and also to remind you that if you want to ask questions, you should do that through the chat function. And the first person I'm going to acknowledge, Isabella Ordorica, my wonderful research assistant, who's a student here at UCI School of Law and a member of the Law Review, is going to be monitoring the chat function and posing questions from you to our speakers. And none of this would have been possible without Isabella's fantastic assistance. I also wanted to just acknowledge a couple of other people, Jillian Henry, Robbie Kadri, Aaron Hebert, Angie Middleton, Anna Illiff, and Colleen Tarakani, all of whom are part of our dedicated staff here at the law school, who help us to make sure that these events run smoothly and give you the best opportunity to hear from and inquire of our speakers. So they keep our intellectual life robust. I also would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Dean Song Richardson and the UC Irvine School of Law for their support of this initiative, as well as Ajay Mehrotra, the director of the American Bar Foundation, and the foundation for its support of the Future of Latinos initiative, which is hosting this event. Now let me get to the introductions. Our speaker today, María Rendón, is an associate professor of urban planning and public policy here at UC Irvine. And she is going to be talking about her new book, Stagnant Dreamers, How the Inner City Shapes the Integration of Second-Generation Latinos. And this book has won so many awards that I just wanted to give you a flavor of how highly regarded it is in the field. She has won the Robert E. Park Award, the Distinguished Contribution to Research Book Award, an honorable mention for the Thomas and Zaniecki Best Book Award, and she was a finalist for the Pierre Bourdieu Book Award, and is also a finalist for the International Latino Book Award. And if you want either of those, feel free to let us know. We didn't know at the time that we got the bio. She's already hard at work on another book project, which is an historical and longitudinal examination of how the Mexican origin population has integrated into Southern California. The project is called A Century of Mexican Immigration, Time of Arrival, Cohort Effects, and Place of Destination. So keep your eyes out. I'm sure that will be coming out and be another tremendous contribution to the field. Now, I also wanted to mention, because for all the students out there, you know, I wanted you to know that Professor Rendón got her PhD in Sociology and Social Policy at Harvard University. She was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Scholar at UC Berkeley before joining the faculty at UC Irvine. And she actually got her bachelor's degree in Sociology and Political Science here at Irvine. And she is from South Los Angeles. She is a child of Mexican immigrants herself and a first-generation college graduate and scholar. So very impressive. And then we're extremely fortunate to have as our commentator, Professor Edward Thayes. And he is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of California at Irvine. He is also a member of the prestigious Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has reoriented the field of sociology beyond the US black-white paradigm through his research and writings on color, race, and ethnicity globally, particularly in Latin America and for Latinos in the United States. He has won numerous awards in the field of immigration and race, and his work has been hailed as path-breaking. He is the principal investigator on the Project on Ethnicity and Race in Latin America, PERLA, and his work has been closely empirical and based mostly on social surveys, a number of which he has collected. His work is well known in Latin America and has been widely published in Spanish and Portuguese. And so I do think we're in for a real treat with these two distinguished scholars. And so I'm going to turn now and let Professor Rendón go ahead and tell us about her book. Thank you.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Rachel, for this nice introduction. And thank you to Eddie Thayes for agreeing to participate and to discuss and make some commentary on my book. So I actually have a couple of slides, maybe too many, and so hopefully we'll see how we do in 20 minutes to get through these slides. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share the screen. Let's see, and you let me know, Rachel, if all looks well
Okay.
on your end. Does that look right?
Yes, looks
okay.
perfect.
Wonderful. Okay, so that's the book. So my book focuses on the Latino second generation in Los Angeles, and it is a book that it was long coming. It was a book that I began initially with a dissertation in graduate school, and that I followed a group of young men, 42 young men, from 2 high poverty neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and into their young adult years. And so what I'm going to share is some of the main findings and contributions that I think I make with this study. Obviously, immigrants have been arriving to our cities for many, many years since they began to develop. And many of us are familiar with the straight line assimilation story, the experience of European immigrants, many of whom landed in some of the poorest pockets of our cities, but over time and across generations were able to move outside these poor pockets of the city and integrate more broadly into American society. Of course, we know that not all groups in American society have had that experience. And many of us today, of course, we continue to wrestle with the legacies of racial segregation. And many of us are very familiar with the story and the experience of African Americans in American society. For this group and many other groups that I'm sure Eddie can speak to, racial segregation confined African Americans and people of color in pockets of the city, impinging on their social mobility, their ability to accumulate wealth, and so on. And so the question I ask here in this book is, what is the experience of Latinos today? And how is it that adapting, how are Latino immigrants and their children adapting to these pockets of the city that continue to be highly segregated and poverty concentrated? And as you can see with my quote there, I focus on the second generation because in many ways, for low-skilled immigrants, for people that come from humble beginnings, with low levels of human capital, and who integrate into the lower tiers of the labor market, we know that the way they get to measure their sense of success in the United States, it's through the accomplishments of their children. And so the book focuses on the immigrant context in Los Angeles, but specifically on the plight of the second generation. And so we know from the quantitative studies out there that a number of studies show that neighborhoods matter a great deal in shaping our life outcomes. Growing up in communities of high poverty, concentration, and segregation are associated with a number of poor health and mental health outcomes, as well as lower educational attainment and lower earnings over the long term relative to those who grow up in more middle class or affluent neighborhoods. So we know that neighborhoods matter, and what we know less of are the social processes that unfold in these neighborhoods that sustain this limited social mobility that we see for residents there. And when it comes to Latinos and children of immigrants, scholars had long, since the early 1990s, had been calling attention to the conditions in these cities. In places like Los Angeles and many other cities in the 80s and 90s, we saw a rise in not only poverty concentration, but issues of crime and violence in these cities. And at this time, as immigration scholars began to study children of immigrants, they were noticing that they were falling behind other groups in educational attainment. We were beginning to see the higher rates of incarceration for many of these youth. And they were concerned that instead of experiencing upward mobility from one generation to the next, that we would actually see second generation decline, or what scholars called downward assimilation. And by this, the scholars meant a detachment from work, a detachment from school, and experiencing, in essence, worse outcomes, more relative to their immigrant parents. And so I began the study very much motivated by this theoretical framework of segmented assimilation and the idea that young people, children of immigrants in the inner city, were destined to experience a downward assimilation trajectory. Now, a little bit about the study. I already mentioned that this study began a while back initially as part of the dissertation. During that time period, I immersed myself into neighborhoods in Los Angeles, in the East LA and South LA area, two pockets of the city where poverty rates there are about 35 to 40%. And these are really some of the poorest pockets of our city here in Southern California. One of the communities was a Mexican immigrant community. The other one was Latino and African American. And I selected these two neighborhoods because there were part of the reason why scholars were suggesting that we would see downward assimilation had to do with acculturation processes. And the idea that being exposed to racial minorities who had developed an oppositional culture, that would actually, that was a mechanism that was driving this downward assimilation. And so I wanted to compare young men in both of these neighborhoods. I interviewed and focused on 42 young men. I interviewed them multiple times that year, got to know them fairly well as their immigrant parents. One of the things that I wanted to make sure in the study was that these young men were not just young men who had not graduated from high school or who were involved in crime and violence. We have a number of good studies, for example, on Latino young men who are involved in gangs and violence and these sorts of things. But I knew that the majority of young men in these neighborhoods, in fact, did not join gangs and violence, that many of these young men in these neighborhoods were graduating high school, and many of them also were making an effort to get through college and so on. So as I selected the young men in the study, I made sure that they varied in their educational attainment at the time when I first met them. And again, you know, I started the study as a graduate student, but when I became an assistant professor and I was beginning to write this book, it occurred to me that it was really hard to write a story on the Latino second generation and their social mobility paths because we had just, we were just coming out of the Great Recession. And so I returned to the field to see how these young men had fared, to see how their families had fared during the Great Recession. And this really allowed me to better understand the reach of the neighborhood context, to see to what extent it continued to matter in the lives of these young men, and to really understand how they were then now navigating not only the neighborhood, but institutions of higher education in the labor market. And one of the first findings that came out very quickly as I was doing the data collection was the salience of violence in these neighborhoods. And I spend a lot of time in the book describing the way in which immigrants were sort of, they experienced this rude awakening, settling into Los Angeles in the 80s and in the 90s as violence peaked in these neighborhoods. Many of them, these immigrants were coming from small rural towns in Mexico, and I focus in this book primarily on the Mexican origin group, and were really struck by the violence. And so many of the conditions and the concerns that these immigration scholars had voiced were actually also voiced by the parents. They themselves were also concerned not only about the safety and well-being of their families, but the future of their children. And navigating and managing that context and neighborhood context became very important for these families. And in the book, I describe how these families pulled together on their resources, primarily their kin and community ties, to buffer the majority of young men in these neighborhoods. And so again, the concern with scholars, of course, was that these were very detrimental neighborhood conditions. And the idea here was that the bulk of these young men were experiencing this downward assimilation into chronic poverty. Of course, I had selected these young men on these different educational trajectories. And what I found was not so much downward assimilation. There is somewhat of an uplifting story in this book, in the sense that projection did not really unfold for most of these young men. The young men who were failed to complete high school or were pushed out of high school, most of them were very firmly attached to the labor market. And many of them were trying to get back to school, enroll in high school, get their diplomas. And so in some ways, what I was able to see in the data after following these young men was a reproduction of the working class of their parents, right? And on the one hand, this is an uplifting story in the sense that I don't see so much patterns of downward assimilation. At the same time, the young men that I was hopeful would shed, that would be a breaking entry into the American middle class, the college-going young men were also actually, I was finding that many of them were looking very similar, like the rest of the young men in the study. So it became very clear that the college-going young men were struggling and were confronting a number of barriers to get ahead and in their young adult years. So the first thing I want to address is, why we did not see downward assimilation to the extent that we did in these neighborhoods. And again, the mechanism that these immigration scholars had suggested were acculturation processes. The idea that the inner city had this dominant oppositional culture that somehow lured and sort of the young men to engage in, disengage from school and engage in crime and violence and these sorts of things. And what I found was that the Latino immigrant communities were actually morally contested communities. As immigrants established roots in these neighborhoods, as they built relationships with each other through kin primarily, but with each other and neighborhood institutions, they made claims on these neighborhoods and referred to them as working class neighborhoods. And the young men had to navigate these morally contested neighborhoods where immigrants really pushed back against the violence and the social disorder as they altered the social cultural context of these neighborhoods. So young men, it was not just a case that there was this oppositional culture. Strong moral boundaries were drawn in these neighborhoods where, on the one hand, we had stigmatized gang-affiliated young men that were linked to the violence in these neighborhoods, and on the other hand, immigrants upheld the work ethic of their immigrant co-ethnics, and particularly in Los Angeles, where we see high rates of an undocumented population. The undocumented population in particular was held in high moral regard. So the young men navigate this culturally contested context. It was also the case that many of these immigrants arrived to Los Angeles through networks, right? Migrant networks facilitate the migration process. And many of them landed in Los Angeles with kin ties, and were able to tap into these family relations as a way to support one another in these neighborhoods. With time, of course, even those who came from, for example, the urban big cities in Mexico, where they don't have these historically deeply rooted networks of paisanos or co-networks, they over time were able to establish links in the community with community organizations and so on. And so we began to see that there is, that the immigrant community establishes these kin and community ties, and it is a kind of social capital that I see in the community. And this is important because prior to this, immigration scholars tended to characterize the Mexican community as lacking social capital, primarily because the Mexican community is comprised of working class and working poor individuals. Unlike ethnic enclaves where we see, for example, the Chinatowns and so on, where we see cross-class ethnic ties, the Mexican community is characterized primarily of working class ties in these neighborhoods. And so because of this, the literature tended to depict these communities as having somewhat of a deficit. And in the book, I argue how, in fact, these community ties are an asset for these immigrants and their children. And so in the book, I describe how these were the ties that were tapped into as a way to buffer the young men from the violence in the neighborhood, and later on to help them navigate the labor market as well. Now, of course, it is really important to point out that not all immigrants arrive with these dense networks. One of the things that's I learned having interviewed these families and these young men was that not all immigrants arrived connected to kin and family. There were and there are families in these neighborhoods that have limited social networks and social support. And I describe these as socially isolated immigrant families. And I found in my book that it was these families that tended to have the weakest connection to kin and to community, that had young men who were much more exposed to the neighborhood, who didn't have the protection of kin and family to buffer them from the neighborhood and the violence. And these were the young men that were more exposed to the neighborhood, to its violence, and to all the negative repercussions that come with being exposed to violence, from the crime and becoming entangled with conflicts to the very serious consequences that it has on schooling. And so for young men who were highly exposed to the violence, this impacted them, and the effect was felt over time as they struggled not only with limited schooling, but then with very few resources to help them navigate the labor market. So kin and community ties then buffered the second generation and inhibited downward assimilation. So someone like Noel, who graduated from high school, was more or less detached. He was not necessarily going to go to college, and he actually but he was very linked and strongly attached to his family, to family events. It was part of an everyday weekend sort of situation. They were very closely knit, and he worked with family and uncles in his high school years. And for young men like Noel, who did not go on to college, they resorted to the ties in the network, in the immigrant network, for jobs and to navigate the labor market. There were other young men who struggled a bit more. Young men like Irvine, who did not graduate from high school and struggled more in the labor market. Yet in these cases, it was always family that they turned to for jobs. And so Irvine, had construction jobs with uncles. His brother-in-law got him a job through a game store. His mother got him a job at some point at an elementary school. His undocumented father-in-law helped him get a job at the garment district. And eventually his sisters were key to getting him into the hospitality industry, where he worked for many years in the hotels. And so we see here that kin community ties not only buffered and protected these young men, but as they took them to work and they removed them from the neighborhood context. In some cases, parents, of course, linked their sons to sports and other kinds of community activities, right? And that also functioned to protect these young men. But it was most often the case that the second generation relied on kin and family ties to protect them in the neighborhood. So the second generation relied on kin and neighborhood ties to navigate the labor market. And one might think that, okay, well, we might expect that for the young men who did not complete high school, or for those who even completed high school. But we would not expect to see that for the college graduates or those who were trying to make their way through institutions of higher education. But in the study, I found that just like these other young men, the college-going young men very often also turn to kin and community ties to help them find jobs, to help them navigate the higher education. By the time that I completed the study, most of these young men, regardless of whether they had gone to college or graduated or not, were roughly earning about $15 an hour. So they were very much in line with the median income in their neighborhood. And what I argue in the book is that the way we can make sense of this is by thinking through how segregation has this long reach into the adult years. Segregation not only constrains the social networks of immigrants, but also the Latino second generation. And again, up until now, the literature that discussed the networks of immigrants tended to focus on immigrants, less so on the second generation. And again, the concern there was with the limited cross-ethnic, cross-class ties in the ethnic community. And what I add is that we need to think beyond the ethnic community to think about how conditions in American society actually reinforce these insular ethnic ties in these Latino working class neighborhoods. And this is the best illustrated, I think, through the cases of young men who left these neighborhoods, who skipped all the violence and crime, and who were able to go to the university and managed to pull through and get their degree. And I highlight the case of Manuel. He tends to be my more sort of exceptional case, but Manuel was an Ivy Leaguer who struggled to get through, switched his from engineering to Spanish literature because it was really hard coming from the inner city to be in an Ivy League and to kind of keep up with his peers. But Manuel was very proud of his accomplishment. He graduated from this elite institution, but he had spent so much time making sure he studied and got through and to graduate that he missed the opportunity while he was at his institution to develop his social networks, right? Through social networks, through internships, or through mentors that could potentially open opportunities for him, broker his entry into the labor market as a college grad. And so for young men like Manuel, they return to these neighborhoods and they begin to look for jobs. And very often in this way that their other young men in their neighborhoods, they tap into ties, to kin ties, to community ties. And of course, these ties then lead them to jobs that are working class jobs, right? So Manuel, after 2 years, having graduated from the Ivy League, had worked at Target, had worked in the garment district, had worked as a gardener, right? And as he pointed out, there was no shame in these jobs, but given his credentials, he would have expected himself to end up somewhere else, right? And so, he talked about how, when he confronted his labor market experience, he commented that this is not where he's supposed to be, right? And so the young men who did well in this from these neighborhoods, the young men who we could say experienced some sort of social mobility, were more likely to have diplomas, yes, but it was not just the diploma that allowed these young men to get their foot into middle-class jobs. It was access to social leverage ties, not being disconnected the way Manuel was from his institution, but finding individuals in these institutions that were able to broker the labor market. And so young men like Osvaldo, who ended up working for the county and in animal control, had a nicely paid job, and talked about how he was able to get this job through someone who vouched for him and opened doors that he had met a while back. And so the young men who were doing well, I can say in their mid to late 20s, were those who had a story about their palancas, their social leverage ties. And so I talk about these young men as well, because it's very important. Their stories are actually very similar. Many of them had trouble navigating these various institutions of higher ed, from community colleges to elite institutions. And yet those who ended up doing well were not necessarily the one with the most prestigious degrees, but rather those who had the diploma and who had developed social leverage ties along the way. These young men were able to expand their networks beyond kin and neighborhood ties, and these networks ended up being very productive for them. On the very opposite end of the spectrum with these young men are those who not only lacked social leverage ties, but the social support ties that I talked about in the beginning. These were young men who were socially isolated in these neighborhoods, young men like Valentin, who had actually grew up with kin, moved around as a foster youth, and who didn't have the support structure that most young men in my study had. These young men had their families were characterized by strained or broken kin ties, usually some form of abuse or violence in the background. And the stories, I sort of describe what some of these families had to undergo. Many of these immigrant families were isolated and arrived. Part of the reason why they left and came to this country was to escape some of these issues in the family and whatnot. And so again, we see that over time, it is these young men who lack these kin and community ties that were most vulnerable in the city. These young men were not able to tap into uncles and cousins and so on to navigate the labor market. They were very much on their own. And being in these neighborhoods where there was these strong moral boundaries, right, against gang members and young men who had been involved in gang and crime and violence, and on the other hand, this typical sort of prototypical idea of a strong, hardworking immigrant person in the neighborhood. These young men very well knew where they stood, right, in this morally contested neighborhood. And so these young men not only were the most vulnerable and marginalized within the neighborhood, but they were also the ones that sort of carried the brunt of the stigma, right, that is associated with the inner city, as they were marginalized within the neighborhoods, and of course from outside society. The last point that I want to make about the book is the way that this concept of the American dream was held on very closely by the majority of the young people in my study. Young men, as studies have shown that in the inner city, their urban residents hold very strongly to meritocratic ideals. And this, of course, involves a strong sense of individualism. And so despite the number of challenges that the young men were facing as they entered higher education, tried to leave the neighborhood and navigate the labor market, most of them remained optimistic, identifying or suggesting there were no true barriers to get ahead in American society, that all it took was hard work and effort And as Renato said, you mix those things up, and then you get yourself where you want to be. Achieving the American dream, David said, is in the person's mind. Anything is possible if all you got to do is just push yourself. And these were the perspectives of many young men in these neighborhoods. They contrast with this idea that there is pessimism in the inner city among inner city young men. And again, it's in line very much with what we have found in the academic research. This ideology, however, as we saw with the previous case, with Valentin, the young man that did not have social support, ended up being very detrimental for these young men. On the one hand, those with social support ties and who had this ideology remained optimistic, and kin support sort of helped them, buffer them from a number of conditions in the neighborhood and challenges in the neighbor market. But those who were on their own only had this meritocratic ideology to hold on to, right? And so this meritocratic ideology suggests that if we work hard, we get ahead. And the opposite is that if we struggle, it is our fault, right? And so what we see for these isolated young men is that they were very much self-blamers, right? They blamed themselves. They blamed not so much the American opportunity structure for sort of complicating their ability to get ahead, but really blamed themselves. This line of thinking I found also to be problematic for many of the young men that ended up going to colleges and universities, because by upholding these individualistic orientations, many of them felt that, you know, you were supposed to do it on your own in the university, that, you know, that you weren't supposed to look for ties and support. You're supposed to just work hard, right? And so, so the urban context, there is a paradox in these urban neighborhoods, where on the one hand, we know that there are conditions in the neighborhoods, segregation and violence, right, that limit social mobility for young people there. At the same time, these neighborhoods are places where folks really hold strongly to this American dream sort of concept and ideologies. And so I think I'm gonna end there. I guess the last thing that I would say is that those that really began to think and question the American opportunity structure, including the role of race and class, were not those who were the most entrenched in these neighborhoods. The young men like Valentin, who really kind of were confined to the neighborhood. It was actually the young men who began to make their way into mainstream society. Those who stepped out of the segregated context began to face structural barriers for their mobility, began to voice much more clearly these class and how race mattered in the labor market, how class mattered for how they navigated these institutions of higher education, and how also having grown up in their neighborhoods followed them over time. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rendón. We'll now hear from Professor Thayes with his commentary.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
You're good.
Good afternoon and buenas tardes. Thanks, Rachel and Isabella, for organizing this and the wonderful intro and inviting me to be part of this great seminar. I am honored to be discussing Professor María Rendón's work. First of all, María, congratulations.
Thank you.
On completing such an important book. I remember talking to you about this study some 10 years ago, and I even remember you giving me a green folder about your study that I had meant to give you some feedback on. I'm not sure whatever happened to that folder, but its loss was clearly my loss. Your work obviously didn't suffer from lack of my advice. In any case, I'm very happy to see the product of your efforts. This is a beautifully written ethnography. It's a cutting-edge study and has rightly received numerous awards. Dr. Rendón brilliantly uses state-of-the-art social theory, which allows her to raise and address important research questions and understand the social processes involved. She deploys various theories, including those on violence, social networks, dignity and the moral order, immigrant integration, and social capital in the inner city. Her focus is on the West Coast and Latinos rather than previous studies that have examined the Midwest and East Coast using the traditional black-white paradigm. As she's noted, I'll repeat some of these things. Dr. Rendón samples 42 second-generation Mexicans in the inner city of Los Angeles. You say Latinos, but I imagine all or nearly all of them are Mexican. She interviews the entire sample when they were in high school or shortly after in 2007, and half of them again in a second wave in 2012 to 13 when they are 24 to 28 years old. Maria was interested in understanding heterogeneity in her sample, which guided her to choose respondents in two neighborhoods. One, a 95% Latino area, and the other, a mixed Black Latino area, though she didn't find the neighborhoods had much of an effect, right? So more importantly, Maria also chose boys that varied in the amount of social capital and the support provided by their families, which she finds affects their exposure to violence, educational attainment, and most importantly for her, their cognitive frames. And I want to emphasize that a little bit. Maria finds that the high levels of violence in the neighborhoods she studies can powerfully derail these boys or men from schooling and success, but social capital, particularly the presence of family and community, buffers many of them from its effects. But despite the presence of social ties from kin, the absence of cross-class ties prevented even the college-educated, and even two from elite universities, from reaching the middle class by the second wave. So when they were in their mid-late 20s. Despite huge obstacles, Rendón demonstrates how the second generation's cognitive frames generally sustain a belief in structural opportunity in the American dream. Cognitive frames refer to the social psychological processes or viewpoints of these young men, particularly their belief in their ability to get ahead and in the American occupational structure. She finds that about half of the men she studied fit in the category of resolute optimist, and none, zero, were oppositional, an important corrective to much of the previous literature. A notable finding is that resolute optimists who believed the most in meritocracy were the most entrenched in the segregated neighborhoods, as she's told us. Rather, it was the young men who spent more time outside the segregated urban context, such as those who went to college, whose views shifted as they experienced discrimination and confronted America's stark racial and class inequalities. That's a quote. The persistently segregated young men also downplayed or dismissed, as she says, racial discrimination in their effort to get ahead, as they were fully conscious of their immigrant parents' hard work, struggle, and sacrifice to get ahead, their ganas, often downplaying structural barriers. And that's kind of the immigrant bargain that many of us have talked about. Here's my quibble with the book, though. Maria begins her conclusion with, and I quote, "The children of Latino immigrants are successfully integrating to American society, a society that is increasingly unequal and whose limited class mobility ensures that only a few start at the bottom of the class ladder will reach the so-called American dream." She goes on to say that most will remain, another quote, "most will remain in the ranks of the working poor and working class despite their great optimism, dedication to hard work, belief in educational attainment, and determination to fare better than their parents." Interestingly, of the 21 respondents that Maria followed into the second wave, where there's full information on their completed education, her descriptions of respondents in the appendix reveals that only 50% completed high school, which is not much different from the LAUSD rate for Latino boys at that time, especially in those neighborhoods. So the schools have failed many of them, and their labor market outcomes, even for the college educated, as Dr. Rendón shows, are really pretty poor in their mid-20s. Now, I'm granted it's not downward assimilation, although some people might disagree if you look at other outcomes like health and incarceration. Thus, I am surprised at Maria's optimistic conclusions about successful integration, despite her evidence, but apparently that optimism is based on the respondents' attitudes, choosing instead to downplay their socioeconomic outcomes. Mind you, the poor outcomes are not merely for the second generation. As third and fourth generation outcomes for many Mexican Americans are not much better, as I and others have shown. In another sense, I am not fully surprised of that conclusion because it reflects a broader concern of mine, which is the excessive optimism among several of the leading scholars of immigrant integration. And here I go off into a general concern I have of the field. Sometimes I think that we need to place our analytical lens on the social scientists themselves. Despite my deep respect for their work, I think the label resolute optimist characterizes the cognitive frames of some of them. These liberal scholars seem to have a greater concern that we report findings that are in line with the positive narratives of America as the land of immigrants and endless opportunity, and the American dream, seeking to avoid the nativist blowback that might come from the reporting of negative results. This is particularly true when it comes to Mexican immigration. In my view, this also precludes the creation and design of appropriate social policies. By the way, this is also apparent in the Democratic agenda today, which is scared of looking soft on immigration, especially regarding the undocumented, even if it refers to their US citizen children and not the immigrants themselves. Rather, Dr. Rendón makes a lasting contribution by showing us the paradox between the low status of her respondents and their endorsement of meritocracy and the American dream, thus revealing the power of the national narratives on immigration and opportunity. At the same time, she has masterfully uncovered the problems and the mechanisms underlying the many social problems that confront much of the second generation, which require social policy responses in education, policing, social welfare, and the labor market. Thank you, Maria, for giving us this study, which is sure to become influential for understanding and addressing the problems of this growing but still forgotten population.
Thank you so much.
Did you want to respond, Professor Rendón, or should we open it up for questions? We have about 12 minutes.
Okay. I think briefly, the only thing I'll say is that, yeah, I keep going back to that opening remark in my conclusion, where I do say that they have successfully integrated into basically racial inequality in the United States. And I think that I may have, I could have said that a little bit differently. I think that I was hoping to call attention to the fact that their integration is exactly to a society that is sort of designed in some ways to not allow so much class mobility, right? And so, but I very much welcome your comments. I think they're great, and thank you so much for taking a look at my book so closely. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open it up now to questions from the audience. Isabella, would you like to give us some of the questions in the chat function?
Yes, I'll start with the questions. So first we have a lot of praise for your book, and this question goes into mentoring. So it says, your book further emphasizes the need for us first-gen faculty to provide mentorship to under and graduate students. Could you please expand on what the most successful approach is to this type of mentoring?
Oh, yes, thank you so much for that question. I'm hoping that that we think more carefully about how we make this not just a role for faculty, because usually it's faculty of color or it's women, right, who take on many of these students. But rather how we need to think about the ways and institutions needs to be much more responsive, either through programs that do identify these first-gen students and provide them the support that they need, right? And so it is challenging, I think, especially for those of us who are first-gen scholars ourselves, who are still, you know, we get the job and we're trying to figure it out, and we also need mentorship, and you know, it is a lot of demand for many of us who are trying to navigate these institutions, and while also trying to help those that are coming behind us, right? And I think there are a number of very creative ways that people do it. I try to enroll my undergraduate students in my research project, have several of them that are contributing now. We don't get any credit for the undergraduates who get involved in research projects, right? But these are the sorts of things that I think about as I reflect back why someone like me, who was also a first generation undergraduate student, were able to get to graduate school, right? And it was because I had faculty and I had staff who were looking out for me, who were including me, and who were connecting me to a number of additional programs in the university and outside.
Professor Theus, did you want to speak to that, or shall we move on to the next question?
We should finish the questions. This is great.
So our next question is, what local, state, or federal policies can we advocate for to support or prevent students from becoming socially isolated?
I think a lot about the role, again, of institutions of higher ed, right? And so we give a lot of attention to accepting, right, students of color, first generation students, folks like that, and we, you know, and you know, not too long ago I wrote an op-ed piece where I made the point that it can't just be about letting them in and giving them financial aid. That is very important. That is the first step. But once they're in the university, we need to connect them, right, to the resources on campus. I think require sort of a look at how institutions, from community colleges to elite institutions, are integrating these students when they come into a campus. But as I think more broadly about state and local and national policies, obviously I think the book makes a very strong argument for the role of family, how important family and kin ties are as a way to protect the children of immigrants in these urban environments. And so, you know, obviously immigration law that favors family reunification, right, that tries to keep families together is essential, because this is, at the end of the day, the primary form of social support for many of these families, right? And so we need to think about that, about these larger immigration policies. And the same can be said about, you know, housing policies, right? We live in a spatially unequal society where we have a good number of hard to reach affluent communities and an increasingly growing number of very poor communities, right? And we have, especially in places like, really it's all over the country, but in places like Los Angeles, right, housing is not affordable, right? It's making it very difficult for the new generation who is doing a little bit better than, say, the immigrant population to actually move out of these neighborhoods. They're not able to. It's really expensive now to make your way into other communities. So I think thinking about housing remains an important policy area of concern.
Thank you. Next one is, in your research, what is the easiest access point for second generation Latinos to move up in economic class?
Oh, that's a great, it really varied. You know, the young men that I highlighted in my study, the ones that I described as doing well, one of them was a UC graduate, another one had a vocational degree and training, right? Another one was from a Cal State University. I think very often we put a lot of emphasis to the prestige and of these institutions, and we all know that prestige matters in many different ways. However, many of the Latino young men are struggling across these different institutions, right? Whether it's a community college and getting stuck there for 6-7 years, unable to transfer, right? Or struggling the way Manuel did in the elite institution. So I think there's not one particular path that is more promising. We can think about a number of several of these young men did well for themselves so long they were able to find, right, key institutional agents that were able to link them and broker that entry into the labor market. That was really key. And those relationships really you can build across these different institutions.
Has anyone studied whether social networking skills can be taught to these young men?
I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure there are folks who look at perhaps folks who work in community organizations. The concept of social capital is one that's been around for quite a while. And it's something that I think specifically those who, folks who work in the inner city and in urban neighborhoods are cognizant that a strong social capital in these neighborhoods protect young people in these neighborhoods. And so I do believe that there are efforts, local efforts that are, community members are constantly trying to build that social, whether they call it social capital or not, right? And I think some of this happens very organically, right? Like the mothers who sign up their kids for baseball or some sort of sport in the inner city. Very often it's not just as a way to engage them in sports, and that's a good, healthy thing to do, but very often it's a way to protect the young men in these neighborhoods, right? So I think this happens organically. And I think some folks in nonprofit organizations, community organizations, try to build that in these communities. And quite honestly, I have cases in the study where, some, young men who we would expect end up in a negative path. Actually, these community organizations really do turn their life around by offering that kind of support that they need. So I think there's a lot of promise there. The challenge, of course, is that many of these nonprofit organizations and community organizations often have limited funds, right? They have limited reach in their ability to kind of tap into the wider community.
Did the type of college completed and/or their major mattered for outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. People always point to Manuel, who I said had a Spanish literature degree, and they're like, well, what can you do with a Spanish literature degree? He tried actually to go to grad school for a bit, and then he just he decided that it was not his thing. Yes, I think we do need to pay some attention to some of these degrees, right? But I mean, people who are getting into medical school, are not just bio majors, right? I think we need to think very carefully about the multiple paths to success that are out there. And I think that's what makes it really challenging for first generation college students, right? Right now, one of the projects that I'm involved in here at UCI is actually looking at the experience of bio students. We know that many of Latino students fall out of STEM. This is one of the fields, right, where our community struggles a whole lot to kind of get through, to get into medical school and so on. And yet, and sometimes it's like the chem class, right, that kind of derails these young men, young people away from that path. And yet there are other avenues through which that young people can actually get very very important, careers in the health field, for example. I think we need to do a lot more guidance for our first generation college students, because we come in, or students come in unfamiliar, right, with these different paths, and it can be very daunting and confusing. And so I think about those things as in reference to that question.
Well, I think we're about out of time. We just have a minute left, so I wanted to take that time first to thank Professor Rendón, Professor Diaz, for what I think was a very stimulating conversation, both about how social capital can protect against downward mobility, but may not necessarily automatically promote upward mobility, and hence there's a kind of stagnation for the stagnant dreamers. I also appreciated all of you who joined us today for your participation and your very interesting and valuable questions. I finally did want to remind you that our next talk in the series will be on Monday, October 12 at 12 noon with Laura Enriquez of Love and Papers, How Immigration Policy Affects Romance and Family. So we thank you again, and it's very hard to applaud on Zoom, but I offer my applause for what was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.